In the winter of 1847, something arrived in the remote mountain town of Milbrook, Vermont, that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They called him Samuel Hawthorne, though that name appears nowhere in any official records from before that terrible February night when he emerged from a blizzard that had claimed 17 lives across Windham County. What the townspeople discovered about this man, who spoke of distant lands beyond the mountains and demonstrated medical knowledge that saved dozens during a deadly outbreak of winter fever, would shake their faith in human nature itself and reveal truths about survival that civilized minds refuse to accept. For over a century and 70 years, the Milbrook Historical Society has kept certain documents locked away from public view. Documents that detail not just who Samuel Hawthorne really was, but what he had done to survive in those frozen peaks, and more terrifyingly, what he continued to do long after his rescue. The truth about Samuel Hawthorne isn't just a story of survival gone wrong. It's a testament to how far a human being can fall when civilization strips away, and how monsters can hide behind the masks of saviors while slowly converting entire communities to their twisted philosophy of existence. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Hawthorne and the winter that changed Milbrook forever, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one dig deep into America's darkest historical secrets. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, because you might be surprised how many similar disappearances happened in your area during those harsh winters of the 1840s. The pattern of mysterious vanishings that followed Samuel Hawthorne's path through New England affected over 60 families across 4 states, and the authorities never connected the dots until it was far too late. The records I'm about to share with you come from sources that have never been digitized, never been made public, and for good reason. They contain details about human nature that most people aren't prepared to confront. Milbrook, Vermont, in 1847, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Nestled in a valley between the Green Mountains, roughly 40 miles northeast of Bennington, the town barely scratched 300 souls, most of them farmers, loggers, and their families trying to make an honest living from unforgiving land. The settlement had been established in 1789 by Revolutionary War veterans seeking cheap land and a fresh start, but by the 1840s it had become one of those forgotten communities that existed in the gaps between larger towns, connected to the outside world only by treacherous mountain roads that became impassable for months during winter. The winter of 1846-47 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that the town's doctor, Ezekiel Putnam, a Harvard-educated physician who had come to Milbrook in 1843 seeking a simpler life after losing his practice in Boston due to gambling debts, recorded in his journal that whiskey froze solid in bottles left overnight. The Connecticut River, which normally provided the town with fresh water and a route for trade goods, had frozen to a depth of 4 feet by January. Even the hardiest locals, men like Norwegian immigrant Henrik Bergström, who had survived winters in the Arctic Circle, spoke of this season as unlike anything they had experienced. The town's heart was Main Street, a muddy thoroughfare in summer, a frozen wasteland in winter, lined with Jeremiah Prescott's General Store, a 2-story wooden building that served as the community's primary source of supplies and unofficial news center. Prescott, a shrewd merchant who had moved from Connecticut in 1839, kept meticulous records of every transaction and every piece of gossip that passed through his establishment. His ledgers would later become crucial evidence in understanding the extent of Samuel Hawthorne's influence over the community. The Milbrook Inn, run by the widow Abigail Fortesque, stood at the eastern end of Main Street. Mrs. Fortesque, whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years prior, maintained rooms for the occasional travelers who found themselves stranded in Milbrook during their journeys through the mountains. Her inn also served as the town's informal social center, where farmers and loggers would gather on winter evenings to drink corn whiskey, play cards, and share news from the outside world. The modest white church, where Reverend Isaiah Greenfield delivered sermons to increasingly thin congregations, dominated the town square. Greenfield, a stern Congregationalist minister who had been educated at Yale, had arrived in Milbrook in 1844 with dreams of building a strong Christian community in the wilderness. By the winter of 1847, however, his congregation was struggling with doubts that went far deeper than the typical challenges of frontier life. The harsh realities of surviving in such an isolated place were testing everyone's faith in divine providence. Most families lived in simple wooden houses heated by whatever firewood they could gather before the snows made the forests impassable. The more prosperous residents, like Thomas and Grace Thornbury, who owned the largest farm in the valley and employed several local men as seasonal workers, had two-story homes with multiple fireplaces and cellars for storing preserved food. The Thornburys had 3 children: Sarah, 12 years old and already helping with household duties; Mary, 8 years old and known for her bright curiosity about everything around her; and young William, just 5 years old and the apple of his mother's eye. By February of 1847, Milbrook was struggling in ways that went beyond the typical hardships of a harsh winter. The community had already lost 5 residents to the cold and disease. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger who had been found frozen in his cabin after the chimney collapsed during a January blizzard, had been beloved by the children for his stories of trolls and northern lights. Margaret Fairchild's baby had died of pneumonia despite Dr. Putnam's best efforts, leaving the young mother in a state of grief so profound that she barely spoke to anyone anymore. Most concerning was the growing shortage of food and medical supplies. The last supply wagons had arrived in late November, and no one expected any relief until the spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Dr. Putnam's medical supplies were nearly exhausted. He was down to his last bottles of laudanum and quinine, and his surgical instruments were showing signs of wear that made him increasingly anxious about performing even basic procedures. People were beginning to whisper about the cursed winter that seemed to have settled over their small community like a burial shroud, and some of the older residents spoke in hushed tones about abandoning Milbrook entirely when spring arrived. It was into this desperate, isolated world that Samuel Hawthorne emerged from the storm, carrying with him knowledge and supplies that seemed too good to be true. And as the townspeople would discover, they were. February 18th, 1847. The date is burned into the memory of every Milbrook family that survived what came after, recorded not just in Dr. Putnam's medical journals but in the personal diaries of at least 6 residents who documented the strange events that began that night. Young Timothy Prescott, Jeremiah's 14-year-old son, was the first to spot the figure stumbling down the mountain path in the middle of a blizzard that had already buried 3 feet of new snow in the valley since dawn. The boy had been checking the store's rear windows for ice damage when he saw what looked like a walking corpse silhouetted against the white fury of the storm. Timothy's first instinct was to dismiss the figure as a hallucination brought on by staring too long into the swirling snow. But as he watched, the shape resolved into unmistakably human form. The figure moved with purpose, following the winding path down from the high peaks with a confidence that seemed impossible in such conditions. Most travelers caught in blizzards wandered randomly, becoming increasingly disoriented until they collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. This person walked as if following a map that only he could see. The boy called for his father, and within minutes, half the men in town had gathered at Prescott's store to watch the strangers approach. What they saw defied their understanding of what was possible in such weather. The figure walked upright against winds that were bending trees nearly horizontal. His pace was steady, unhurried, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll through pleasant weather instead of battling conditions that had already killed several travelers that winter. Samuel Hawthorne arrived at death's door, or so it seemed. His clothes were strange, made of materials that folks in Milbrook had never seen before. The outer garment appeared to be a long coat or cloak fashioned from what looked like treated animal hide, but the texture was unlike any leather the local farmers and hunters recognized. It was thick, almost armor-like in appearance, and seemed to repel snow rather than absorb it. Underneath, he wore what appeared to be layered clothing made from a tightly woven fabric that looked almost metallic in certain light. His boots were perhaps the most puzzling aspect of his appearance. They were constructed in a way that left peculiar tracks in the snow, deeper than ordinary boots would make, with a distinctive pattern that included what looked like metal studs or spikes arranged in geometric designs. Dr. Putnam later sketched these tracks in his journal, noting they were unlike any footwear manufactured in New England or any European pattern with which I am familiar. The boots appeared to be designed specifically for traversing difficult terrain in extreme weather, suggesting a level of craftsmanship and specialized knowledge that seemed inconsistent with Hawthorne's claim to come from a simple mountain community. But it was Hawthorne's physical condition that first truly unsettled the townspeople. Despite having allegedly wandered through a killing blizzard for what he claimed were many days and nights of walking through the White Death, he showed none of the signs of severe frostbite that should have claimed his fingers and toes. His cheeks were ruddy with cold, yes, but his extremities were perfectly intact. His movement was fluid and coordinated, and his speech was clear and articulate. Dr. Putnam examined him thoroughly and found this so remarkable that he wrote extensively about it, theorizing that Hawthorne must have had access to shelter and proper supplies far more recently than his story suggested. The man himself was tall and lean, standing well over 6 feet in height, with dark hair that seemed prematurely streaked with white, though he appeared to be no more than 35 years old. His build suggested someone accustomed to physical labor and harsh conditions. His hands were calloused and scarred, his shoulders broad from years of carrying heavy loads, his legs powerful from walking long distances over difficult terrain. But it was his face that people remembered most clearly. His features were sharp and angular, with high cheekbones and a prominent nose that gave him an almost predatory appearance. His skin was weathered but healthy, with none of the pallor or signs of malnutrition that might be expected from someone who had been surviving in the wilderness. Most memorable were his eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in certain light, like ice over deep water. The way he looked at people made them deeply uncomfortable, as if he was measuring them for something they couldn't understand. Children found him fascinating in the way they might be drawn to a dangerous animal, while adults instinctively felt the need to keep their distance. Several residents later described the unsettling sensation that Hawthorne was cataloging everything he saw, memorizing the layout of their homes, the routines of their families, the relationships and hierarchies within the community. When he spoke, it was in perfect English, but with an accent that no one in Milbrook could place. It wasn't British, despite some similarities in pronunciation. It wasn't German or Scandinavian, though there were hints of those influences. Dr. Putnam, who had traveled extensively before settling in Vermont, described it as an accent that seems to borrow from many sources while belonging to none. Hawthorne's vocabulary was extensive and precise, suggesting formal education. but he occasionally used words or phrases that seemed archaic or simply unfamiliar to his listeners. His story, when he finally told it, was both compelling and deeply unsettling. He claimed to come from beyond the great peaks, from valleys where the sun shines differently and the seasons follow older patterns. When pressed for specifics about this homeland, he would become vague, speaking of "my people" and the homeland across the white fields where the old ways still guide the wise. He described a community that lived in harmony with the harshest aspects of nature, where survival depended not on fighting the wilderness, but on understanding its deeper rhythms and accepting its necessary cruelties. Children found him fascinating, gathering around whenever he spoke to listen to his stories of distant places and strange customs. Adults found him deeply unsettling, but couldn't quite articulate why. There was something about the way he moved, the way he observed everything around him, the way his pale eyes seemed to see through people rather than simply looking at them, that triggered instinctive alarm responses in anyone who spent more than a few minutes in his presence. The most disturbing aspect of Samuel Hawthorne's arrival, however, was what he carried with him. In a leather satchel that never left his side, a bag made from the same strange, weather-resistant material as his clothing, he kept what he called his medicines and tools of survival. The contents of this bag would later become the source of the town's greatest nightmares. But in those first days, desperate as they were for any kind of help, the people of Milbrook welcomed what seemed like divine intervention in their darkest hour. That first night, as Hawthorne sat by the fire in the Milbrook Inn, warming himself with a mug of Mrs. Fortesque's strongest coffee, he began to demonstrate the knowledge that would make him indispensable to the community. When young Sarah Thornberry began coughing violently, a symptom that had been growing worse over the past week and had Dr. Putnam worried about consumption, Hawthorne listened carefully to the sound and immediately diagnosed the problem as a respiratory infection caused by breathing too much smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces. From his mysterious satchel, he produced a small vial containing a dark liquid that smelled of pine needles and something else, something sweet and organic that no one could identify. He instructed Sarah to take just 3 drops mixed with warm water before bedtime. Within an hour, her coughing had subsided significantly. By morning, she was breathing normally for the first time in weeks. Word of this miraculous cure spread through Milbrook like wildfire, and by the end of Samuel Hawthorne's first full day in town, half the community was lined up outside the inn, hoping for relief from various ailments that had been plaguing them throughout the harsh winter. Within days of his arrival, Samuel Hawthorne had established himself as Milbrook's unofficial second doctor, though his methods were unlike anything the townspeople had ever witnessed. Dr. Putnam, initially skeptical of anyone who claimed medical knowledge without formal training, became grudgingly impressed with the stranger's diagnostic abilities and the effectiveness of his treatments. Hawthorne could diagnose ailments at a glance, identifying conditions that had puzzled Putnam for weeks. He knew exactly which herbs to gather even in the dead of winter, somehow locating medicinal plants buried under feet of snow. And most remarkably, his treatments worked with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. When little Sarah Thornberry developed what Dr. Putnam feared was consumption, the same disease that had killed 3 people in Milbrook the previous winter, Hawthorne prepared a strange concoction that involved boiling certain roots with what he claimed was preserved meat from mountain game, prepared according to the old traditions of my people. The process took several hours and required ingredients that Hawthorne produced from various containers in his seemingly bottomless leather satchel. The smell that emanated from his cooking pot was unlike anything the townspeople had encountered, sweet and sickly, with an underlying odor that reminded several residents of the time Henrik Bergstrom's body hadn't been found for nearly a week after his cabin chimney collapsed. Mrs. Fortesque, who prided herself on her knowledge of cooking and preserving foods, couldn't identify any of the scents coming from Hawthorne's preparation. When she asked about his ingredients, he smiled mysteriously and explained that his people had developed these preservation techniques over many generations of surviving in the harshest mountain conditions. The medicine worked. Sarah recovered completely within 3 days, though she complained of vivid nightmares filled with snow and hungry eyes watching her from dark places. She described dreams of walking through endless white landscapes where shadowy figures called to her in languages she didn't understand, promising her warmth and food if she would only join them in their sacred feast. Her mother, Grace Thornbury, was so grateful for her daughter's recovery that she insisted Hawthorne stay in their family's spare room above the kitchen, despite her husband Thomas's reservations about hosting a stranger about whom they knew so little. It was Grace who first noticed Hawthorne's peculiar habits and began to document them in letters to her sister in Albany, letters that were never sent, but which were preserved in the Thornbury family papers and provided crucial evidence for later investigators. Hawthorne never slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, and always with one ear listening, as if expecting something to find him. He would wake several times each night and spend long periods sitting motionless by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an intensity that made Grace deeply uncomfortable. He would disappear for hours during the worst storms, claiming he needed to gather certain plants and materials for his medicines. These expeditions seemed impossible given the weather conditions, winds that made it dangerous for even experienced outdoorsmen to venture far from shelter, temperatures that could kill an unprepared person within hours. Yet Hawthorne would return from these mysterious journeys with his strange boots barely wet and carrying items that shouldn't have been available in the Vermont wilderness during winter. Fresh meat was the most puzzling of his acquisitions. While the local hunters hadn't seen game for weeks and were surviving on preserved stores from the autumn hunting season, Hawthorne regularly returned with what he claimed were rabbits, deer, and other forest animals that he had trapped or hunted during his excursions. The meat looked fresh and was skillfully prepared, cut into precise portions that he claimed were traditional methods learned from his people. But several of the more experienced hunters in town noticed that the cuts didn't look quite right. The bone structure seemed wrong for the animals Hawthorne claimed they came from, and the meat itself had a texture and color that didn't match what they knew of local game. Dr. Putnam, whose medical training had included some study of anatomy, became increasingly suspicious of Hawthorne's game meat. During one of his examinations of the portions Hawthorne used in his medicines, Putnam noticed what appeared to be cuts of meat that looked remarkably similar to human muscle tissue. When he raised this concern with Hawthorne, the stranger laughed and explained that his people had developed techniques for preparing meat that could make even the toughest animals tender and nutritious. "You must understand, Doctor," Hawthorne said with his unsettling smile, "that survival in the true wilderness requires one to abandon the squeamish attitudes of civilized society. My people learned long ago that all meat is essentially the same. It provides the nutrients needed to sustain life, regardless of its original source. The important thing is proper preparation and the spiritual attitude with which one consumes what nature provides." Grace found him one morning carefully cleaning what appeared to be a woman's silver locket, polishing it with a soft cloth while humming a tune she'd never heard, but which seemed hauntingly familiar. The melody was simple, but deeply unsettling, with a rhythm that reminded her of funeral dirges she'd heard as a child. When she asked about the locket, he smiled that unsettling smile and said it belonged to a dear friend from home who couldn't make the journey but whose spirit travels with me always. But Grace could have sworn she'd seen that exact locket before, around the neck of Rebecca Henley, the wife of merchant James Henley, who had disappeared with her husband during a trip to Albany the previous autumn. The Henleys had been traveling through the mountain passes when an early storm trapped them, and despite extensive searches by local authorities, no trace of them had ever been found. The locket was distinctive, silver, with an intricate floral pattern that Rebecca's grandmother had brought from Ireland. Grace had admired it many times when the Henleys visited Milbrook for supplies. The stranger's room became a source of growing unease for the Thornbury family. Strange sounds emanated from it at night, soft scraping noises, like someone working with small tools, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like muffled crying or whimpering. The sounds were so faint that they might have been dismissed as settling wood or wind through the walls, but they followed patterns that suggested deliberate activity rather than natural phenomena. When Grace's husband Thomas finally worked up the courage to ask about the sounds, Hawthorne explained that he was working on maps to guide me back home when spring arrives, and journals to record the wisdom I've learned during my time among your people. He showed Thomas elaborate drawings on what looked like treated animal hide, marked with symbols and route notations that made no sense to anyone in Milbrook. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing topographical features, weather patterns, and travel routes through terrain that seemed far more extensive than anything visible from Milbrook. But the maps told a disturbing story for anyone who looked closely enough to understand their implications. They detailed every path through the surrounding mountains, every cave and shelter, every place where a person might take refuge during a storm. More troubling still, they included notations in a language none of the townspeople could read, marking certain locations with symbols that looked disturbingly like tally marks. Some areas were marked with what appeared to be numbers, suggesting that Hawthorne was keeping count of something or someone. Dr. Putnam, whose curiosity about Hawthorne's methods had evolved into genuine suspicion, began keeping his own detailed notes about his colleagues' behavior and the effects of his treatments on the townspeople. What he documented would later become crucial evidence in understanding the true nature of what was happening in Milbrook. The first disturbing pattern Putnam noticed was in the way Hawthorne's patients responded to his treatments. While the immediate effects were invariably positive, symptoms disappeared, strength returned, overall health improved dramatically. There were subtle changes in behavior that became apparent over time. Patients who had been treated by Hawthorne began to crave meat with an intensity that seemed unusual, especially given the limited protein available during the harsh winter. They also displayed increased aggression and territorial behavior, becoming protective of their food stores in ways that went beyond normal wartime rationing instincts. More troubling were the psychological changes. Several of Hawthorne's patients began experiencing similar nightmares, dreams of walking through snowy landscapes populated by shadowy figures who offered them sustenance in exchange for joining their eternal feast. These dreams were so vivid and consistent across multiple patients that Putnam began to suspect some form of shared psychological influence, possibly through ingredients in Hawthorne's medicines that affected brain function. The breaking point in Dr. Putnam's growing suspicions came when he decided to analyze one of Hawthorne's medicine preparations using techniques he had learned during his medical training in Boston. Using a microscope he kept for examining tissue samples, Putnam discovered what appeared to be human hair and bone fragments in a powder that Hawthorne claimed was made from ground antler and medicinal roots. When confronted with this evidence, Hawthorne's reaction was swift and chilling. Rather than denying the findings or expressing surprise, he seemed pleased that Putnam had been observant enough to make the discovery. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes gleaming with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "I had hoped someone in this community would possess the intelligence to understand the true nature of my work. Yes, you are correct in your analysis. The most effective medicines are those that incorporate elements from the ultimate source of life, human beings themselves." Putnam's blood ran cold as Hawthorne continued his explanation. "In my homeland, we learned long ago that the human body contains within it all the elements necessary to heal and strengthen other human bodies. When prepared properly, according to the sacred traditions passed down through generations of true healers, human tissue becomes the most powerful medicine available. It creates a bond between those who share in its consumption, a communion that goes far deeper than anything your Christian sacraments could achieve." The implications of what Hawthorne was describing hit Putnam like a physical blow. Not only was this man feeding human remains to the townspeople as medicine, but he was doing so as part of a deliberate plan to psychologically condition them to accept cannibalism as normal and even beneficial. The nightmares, the behavioral changes, the craving for meat, all of it was part of a systematic process of breaking down the psychological barriers that prevented civilized people from engaging in the ultimate taboo. As February melted into March, the situation in Milbrook took an increasingly dark and complex turn. Samuel Hawthorne's medical successes continued to mount, but so did the strange incidents and unsettling discoveries surrounding his presence. Dr. Putnam began keeping detailed notes about his mysterious colleague's methods, partly out of medical curiosity, and partly due to growing suspicions that something profoundly disturbing was happening to his community under the guise of healing. Hawthorne's medical kit contained instruments that Dr. Putnam had never seen in any medical textbook or surgical manual. There were scalpels with unusual curved blades, designed for cutting in ways that seemed more suited to butchery than surgery. Small saws with teeth arranged in patterns that suggested they were meant for cutting through bone rather than performing delicate operations, and various bottles containing powders and liquids that gave off odors unlike any known pharmaceutical preparations. When Putnam asked to examine these substances more closely, hoping to understand their composition and perhaps learn new techniques that might benefit his own patients, Hawthorne would deflect with elaborate explanations about family secrets passed down through generations of healers in the old country, and sacred knowledge that loses its power when shared with those who haven't been properly initiated into its mysteries. The breakthrough in understanding Hawthorne's true nature came when young Timothy Prescott, the same boy who'd first spotted the stranger emerging from the blizzard, made a discovery that would change everything the townspeople thought they knew about their mysterious benefactor. While exploring the woods behind the Thornbury house, Timothy found what he first thought was an animal's den, or perhaps a cave-in from an old mine shaft. The opening was partially concealed by fallen logs and accumulated snow, making it nearly invisible unless someone was looking directly at it from the right angle. But as Timothy investigated more closely, clearing away some of the debris to see how deep the depression went, he realized someone had been using the cave-like space as a carefully organized storage site. The opening led to a natural chamber in the hillside that had been expanded and modified to create a sophisticated cache for preserving materials and supplies. The walls were lined with what appeared to be treated animal hides, but the texture and appearance were unlike anything Timothy had seen local hunters produce. Inside this hidden repository, wrapped in the same strange leather-like material as Hawthorne's clothes, were items that made Timothy's blood run cold, and his hands shake as he unwrapped bundle after bundle of evidence, pointing to something far more sinister than anyone in Milbrook had imagined. There were clothes, lots of them. Men's work shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, all carefully folded and preserved but damaged in ways that suggested they'd been cut away from their owners, rather than simply discarded or outgrown. Some bore dark stains that Timothy, despite his young age, instinctively recognized as blood. The clothing represented styles and fabrics from different regions and time periods, suggesting that this collection had been assembled over several years from many different sources. More disturbing were the personal items. Wedding rings, pocket watches, women's jewelry, children's toys, family photographs, religious items like crosses and prayer books, and dozens of other small objects that families treasured and would never willingly abandon. Each item was carefully cleaned and organized, as if they were trophies being preserved for some specific purpose. But what truly terrified Timothy was the collection of detailed sketches he found wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. They were anatomical drawings, showing the human body in ways that seemed designed for butchery rather than healing. The drawings included careful notations about optimal cutting points for maximum yield, preservation methods for extended storage in winter conditions, and preparation techniques for various forms of consumption. Some sketches showed techniques for breaking down large game animals, deer, elk, bear, with detailed instructions for field dressing and meat preservation. But others clearly depicted human forms with similar notations, treating the human body as simply another source of protein to be harvested and processed. The clinical precision of these drawings, combined with their obvious practical application, suggested that their creator had extensive hands-on experience with the procedures they illustrated. Timothy ran home and told his father, who initially dismissed the boy's story as winter fever imagination brought on by too many ghost stories around the fire. But Jeremiah Prescott was a practical man who had learned to trust his son's observations. And when Timothy led him to the cache, even he couldn't explain away what they'd discovered. The most chilling find was a journal written in the same careful handwriting that had created Hawthorne's maps. The entries were dated going back over 3 years, describing what the author called expeditions into the mountains and encounters with traveling parties and isolated families. The journal detailed these encounters with clinical precision, describing the author's growing expertise in field preservation of resources and maintaining supplies during extended isolation periods. As Jeremiah read through the entries, a horrifying pattern emerged. The journal described a systematic process of stalking and trapping travelers, particularly families or small groups who were vulnerable to the harsh mountain conditions. The author had developed sophisticated techniques for approaching potential victims under the guise of offering assistance, then isolating them in locations where they could be killed and processed without risk of discovery. One entry, dated nearly 18 months before Hawthorne's arrival in Milbrook, described an encounter with a family of 5 traveling to Albany for the father's work as a mill supervisor. The journal detailed how the author had offered to guide them through a mountain pass that would save them several days of travel, only to lead them into a trap during a storm. What followed was described with the clinical precision of a medical procedure, detailing how each family member had been killed and their bodies processed for meat and other useful materials. The journal revealed that this wasn't random violence or simple murder for robbery. It was a calculated system for obtaining human flesh for consumption and for use in the medicines that Hawthorne had been administering to the people of Milbrook. The author described human meat as the most nutritionally complete protein available and detailed various methods for preserving and preparing it for both immediate consumption and long-term storage. Most disturbing of all were the entries describing the psychological effects of consuming human flesh, both on the author himself and on others who had been gradually introduced to the practice. The journal documented a systematic process of breaking down normal human revulsion to cannibalism through gradual conditioning, starting with small amounts mixed into other foods and medicines, then gradually increasing the proportion until the subject was consuming pure human tissue without realizing it. The journal described how this process created psychological changes that made subjects more susceptible to suggestion and more willing to participate in activities they would normally find abhorrent. The author had apparently used this technique to create accomplices in previous communities, turning ordinary people into willing participants in his cannibalistic practices. As Jeremiah finished reading the most recent entries, he realized with growing horror that everything described in the journal was currently being implemented in Milbrook. Hawthorne wasn't just feeding the townspeople human flesh, he was systematically converting them into a community of cannibals who would eventually be willing accomplices in his ongoing campaign of murder and consumption. Armed with this horrifying evidence, Jeremiah Prescott faced an impossible decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The man who had saved his neighbors' lives, who had pulled Milbrook back from the brink of disaster during the worst winter in living memory, was apparently something far more monstrous than anyone had imagined. But how do you accuse your town's savior of being a serial killer and cannibal? Especially when people were still recovering from the illnesses he'd cured, and when his treatments continued to keep the community healthy, despite the ongoing harsh conditions. The evidence was overwhelming, but Prescott realized that simply presenting the journal and sketches to the townspeople might not be enough to convince them. Hawthorne had built up enormous goodwill and trust in the community. People saw him as a miracle worker, a man sent by Providence to save them in their darkest hour. They might dismiss the evidence as fabricated or misinterpreted, especially if Hawthorne offered convincing alternative explanations. Prescott decided to confide first in Dr. Putnam, hoping the educated man might help him understand what they were dealing with and develop a strategy for exposing Hawthorne without causing panic or allowing him to escape before he could be brought to justice. Putnam's reaction was immediate and visceral. He'd been harboring his own suspicions about Hawthorne's methods for weeks, and Prescott's discovery confirmed his worst fears about the true nature of the medicines that had been so remarkably effective in treating the townspeople's ailments. Together, they began a more systematic investigation of Hawthorne's activities and influence in the community. Putnam started asking Hawthorne more pointed questions about his medical training, pressing for specific details about where he'd learned his techniques and what medical authorities had validated his methods. Hawthorne's answers were always vague, filled with references to master healers in distant lands and ancient knowledge passed down through sacred traditions that outsiders couldn't understand without proper spiritual preparation. When Putnam suggested they work together to document Hawthorne's techniques for the benefit of other doctors and medical researchers, potentially publishing their findings in medical journals that could spread these beneficial treatments to communities throughout New England, the stranger became visibly agitated. He insisted that his methods were not meant for outside eyes, and that sharing them with those who hadn't been properly initiated into their deeper meanings would strip them of their healing power and potentially cause great harm. Meanwhile, Prescott quietly began researching the disappearances that had occurred in the region over the past several years, using his connections with merchants and suppliers who traveled the mountain roads to gather information about missing persons and unsolved crimes. What he discovered painted a terrifying pattern that stretched far beyond anything he had initially suspected. Families traveling through the mountain passes had vanished with alarming frequency over the past 4 years. Hunting parties had failed to return from expeditions that should have been routine. Lone travelers had simply disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only occasionally abandoned wagons or campsites that looked as if they'd been hastily vacated. In each case, the disappearances had occurred during winter months when harsh weather made extensive searches impossible and when bodies might not be discovered until spring thaw, if ever. The most chilling discovery came when Prescott found records of similar incidents stretching back over 7 years, following a trail that seemed to move systematically through different regions of Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. Each area would experience a period of mysterious disappearances lasting 2 to 3 years, followed by reports of helpful strangers who appeared during times of crisis. Someone with medical knowledge and survival skills that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. In the mountain town of Grafton, Vermont, in 1844, a mysterious healer named Samuel Hawthorne had appeared during a diphtheria outbreak, saving dozens of lives before disappearing in spring, along with several families who had supposedly decided to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In North Conway, New Hampshire, during the harsh winter of 1845, a man calling himself Samuel Blackthorne had provided crucial assistance during a food shortage, only to vanish when investigators began asking questions about his background and methods. The pattern was identical in each location: arrival during a crisis, establishment of trust through effective medical treatment, gradual introduction of strange practices and medicines, and eventually either the conversion of the entire community to his twisted philosophy, or the elimination of witnesses followed by relocation to a new hunting ground. Dr. Putnam made his own disturbing discovery while conducting a more thorough examination of some of Hawthorne's preserved medicines. Using chemical tests he had learned during his medical training, Putnam confirmed his worst suspicions about the true composition of these miraculous treatments. The medicines contained not just human tissue but tissue from multiple individuals, suggesting that Hawthorne had access to a large supply of human remains that he was systematically processing for various purposes. More horrifying still was Putnam's realization that the medicines were designed to be psychologically addictive. Chemical analysis revealed compounds that affected brain function in ways that made patients crave continued treatment, while simultaneously making them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The miraculous recoveries weren't just the result of effective medicine. They were the product of a sophisticated system of chemical conditioning that made patients dependent on their healer, while gradually breaking down their moral resistance to increasingly disturbing practices. When Dr. Putnam attempted to confront Hawthorne about these findings, the man's reaction was swift and terrifying in its casual honesty. Rather than denying the accusations or expressing outrage at the implications, Hawthorne seemed almost relieved that someone had finally understood the sophistication of his work. "You don't understand the necessities of true survival, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes taking on a predatory gleam that made Putnam's blood run cold. "In the places I've been, in the situations I've faced, one learns that the boundaries between medicine and other necessities become meaningless when survival is at stake. The human body provides what the human body needs, if one has the knowledge and the will to use it properly." Hawthorne continued his explanation with the calm precision of a professor delivering a lecture to interested students. "Your civilized society has created artificial taboos around the most natural and efficient forms of sustenance. My people learned long ago that these taboos are luxury attitudes that only the weak and well-fed can afford to maintain. When winter comes, when food runs out, when death stalks every household, such squeamishness becomes not just foolish, but actively harmful to survival. Putnam left that conversation convinced that Samuel Hawthorne wasn't just a killer, he was something far worse. He was a cannibal who had perfected his methods over years of practice, using medical knowledge to justify and refine his horrific activities while developing techniques for converting entire communities to his twisted worldview. The situation in Milbrook began to escalate rapidly as more townspeople started exhibiting the behavioral changes that Putnam had observed in Hawthorne's patients. The craving for meat became more pronounced, with several families reporting that their members would wake in the middle of the night to consume whatever protein they could find, often eating it raw. Children began playing increasingly violent games that involved detailed discussions of butchering and food preparation. Adults started hoarding personal items from deceased community members, claiming they were keeping their spirits close, but displaying possessive behaviors that seemed more predatory than sentimental. Most disturbing was the way the townspeople began to regard outsiders and potential visitors with suspicious calculation. When a lost traveler stumbled into Milbrook during a March snowstorm, several residents gathered to observe the stranger, with expressions that Dr. Putnam described in his journal as the look of hungry wolves evaluating potential prey. The breaking point came when Grace Thornbury's youngest daughter, Mary, began experiencing symptoms that made it clear just how far Hawthorne's influence had spread through the community. The 8-year-old child developed an insatiable hunger for meat, specifically raw meat, and began having vivid nightmares about the hungry people in the snow, who wanted to share their feast with her and teach her the old ways of eating. Grace found Mary in the cellar at midnight, gnawing on a raw piece of salted pork with an expression of pure animal hunger, her small hands and face smeared with blood and grease. When her mother tried to take the meat away, Mary growled, actually growled like a wild animal, and bared her teeth as if preparing to bite anyone who came between her and her food. The child's eyes held the same pale, predatory gleam they'd all learned to recognize in Samuel Hawthorne. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same unsettling cadence and vocabulary that marked all of Hawthorne's converts. "The teacher says we must learn to eat what the mountain provides," Mary said, licking her bloody fingers with obvious pleasure. "He says the old people were wrong to waste so much good food just because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. He says when we learn the right way to eat, we'll never be hungry again, and we'll never have to fear the winter." Grace realized with dawning horror that her daughter had been systematically conditioned to accept cannibalism as not just acceptable, but desirable, and that this conditioning was happening throughout the community under the guise of medical treatment and survival education. That same night, Thomas Thornbury discovered Samuel Hawthorne in the family's barn, working by candlelight over what appeared to be a large piece of meat spread across the workbench used for processing their livestock. But as Thomas looked more closely, he realized with sick certainty that what Hawthorne was cutting and preparing wasn't any animal that belonged to the Thornbury farm. The meat was pale and fine-textured, with bone structure that was unmistakably human. Hawthorne was working with practiced efficiency, his strange surgical tools gleaming in the candlelight as he separated different cuts and wrapped them in treated cloth for preservation. Around him were arranged various containers holding what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all carefully labeled with symbols that matched those in his mysterious journal. When Hawthorne noticed Thomas watching him, he didn't show any sign of shame or alarm. Instead, he smiled that unsettling smile and gestured for Thomas to come closer, as if inviting him to observe a fascinating demonstration of useful skills. "Ah, Thomas," Hawthorne said in his calm, measured voice. "Perfect timing. I was hoping someone in the family would eventually take interest in learning these techniques. Your children are showing such remarkable progress in accepting the new ways. It would be beneficial for you to understand the practical aspects of what we're doing here." Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing and hearing. Hawthorne continued his work while explaining his methods with the casual tone of someone discussing ordinary farm chores. "This came from the traveler who passed through last week," Hawthorne said, indicating the meat he was processing. "Poor fellow was already dying from exposure when I found him in the woods. Rather than let such valuable resources go to waste, I've been preserving what can be used for the community's benefit. The medicine I prepared for your daughter Mary included portions of this tissue. That's why her recovery from winter sickness was so remarkably complete." The implications of what Hawthorne was saying hit Thomas like a physical blow. Not only was this man processing human corpses for food and medicine, but he had been feeding human flesh to Thomas's own children under the guise of medical treatment. "You're feeding my family. Human beings," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm feeding your family the most nutritious and spiritually powerful sustenance available," Hawthorne corrected calmly. "In my homeland, we understand that the consumption of human flesh creates bonds between people that go far deeper than ordinary social relationships. Those who share in the sacred feast become part of an eternal community that transcends the ordinary boundaries of life and death." Hawthorne set down his tools and turned to face Thomas directly, his pale eyes gleaming with evangelical fervor. "Your family is being transformed, Thomas. Your children are being prepared for a life where they will never again fear hunger, cold, or isolation. They are learning to see the world as it truly is, a place where the strong survive by consuming the weak, where waste is the only sin, and where every death provides the opportunity for continued life." Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Milbrook intensifies beyond anything the townspeople could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because what Thomas Thornbury witnessed in his barn was only the beginning of Samuel Hawthorne's final revelation. The confrontation that would determine Milbrook's fate came on March 15, 1847, during what would later be remembered as the bloodiest night in the town's history. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott had spent the previous day gathering evidence and allies, finally convincing Reverend Greenfield and several other town leaders that Samuel Hawthorne posed a mortal threat to their community. The decision to act had been forced by increasingly desperate circumstances. More townspeople were exhibiting signs of psychological conditioning. Children were disappearing for hours at a time and returning with blood on their clothes and secretive expressions, and several families reported finding human remains hidden in their cellars and barns. The plan was to arrest Hawthorne quietly and search his belongings for evidence that could be presented to federal authorities. But Hawthorne had been watching the community's leaders just as carefully as they had been watching him. When the group of 6 men, Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornbury, innkeeper Joshua Fortescue, Abigail's brother-in-law who had arrived from Bennington the week before, and town constable Marcus Hartwell, approached the Thornbury house that evening, they found the scene transformed into something from their worst nightmares. The house was eerily quiet, but candlelight flickered from every window, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with deliberate purpose. Too quiet for a household that should have contained a family of 5, plus their mysterious guest. The silence was broken only by a low, rhythmic sound that none of them could immediately identify, something between singing and chanting, with a cadence that seemed to match the beating of a human heart. Thomas Thornbury met them at the door, but the man who greeted them was no longer the hard-working farmer they had known for years. Something was wrong with his eyes. They held the same vacant, predatory expression they'd learned to recognize in all of Hawthorne's most devoted followers, but intensified to a degree that made him seem barely human. His movements were fluid and coordinated, like a predator stalking prey, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed somehow sharper than they should have been. Behind him, Grace Thornbury stood motionless in the hallway, her hands stained with what looked like blood, her once neat dress torn and stained with substances that the men didn't want to identify. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face wore an expression of beatific calm that was somehow more terrifying than outright madness would have been. "Samuel has been teaching us about true survival," Thomas said in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. The words carried Hawthorne's distinctive accent and cadence, as if Thomas was reciting lessons he had memorized, about the communion that binds communities together in the deepest winter, and the sacred responsibilities that come with understanding the real nature of sustenance. "Would you like to learn?" Dr. Putnam pushed past Thomas, his medical training overriding his fear as he tried to understand what had happened to the Thornbury family. What he found inside the house was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A nightmare that combined religious ritual with butchery in ways that challenged his understanding of what human beings were capable of becoming. The furniture had been rearranged to create what looked like a primitive altar in the center of the main room. The Thornburys' dining table had been moved to serve as the focal point, surrounded by chairs arranged in a perfect circle. Around this makeshift altar, the remaining members of the Thornbury family sat motionless. Grace, 12-year-old Sarah, 8-year-old Mary, and 5-year-old William, along with several neighbors who had supposedly gone home hours earlier, but who now sat with the same empty, predatory expressions worn by Thomas and Grace. In the center of the circle, Samuel Hawthorne knelt beside the dining table, which had been covered with a white cloth that was now soaked with dark stains. On it lay what Dr. Putnam initially thought was a large piece of butchered livestock, but as his eyes adjusted to the candlelight, he realized with sick certainty that the remains were human. The body had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision, different cuts separated and arranged as if for some grotesque feast. Around the table were arranged various containers, holding what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all carefully prepared and labeled with the same symbols that had appeared in Hawthorne's journal. The clinical precision of the butchery, combined with the ritualistic arrangement of the scene, suggested that this wasn't random violence, but part of a carefully planned ceremony. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said without looking up from his work, his voice carrying the same calm, measured tone he had always used when discussing medical procedures. "Perfect timing. We were just conducting the final stage of young Mary's initiation into the deeper mysteries of survival. You see, the theoretical knowledge can only take one so far. True understanding requires direct participation in the sacred feast." Hawthorne stood slowly, his surgical tools gleaming in the candlelight like implements of some ancient religious ceremony. "The families that disappeared in the mountains didn't die of cold or starvation, Doctor. They became part of something much larger and more meaningful. They contributed to the survival of someone who could use their resources more efficiently than they ever could have managed on their own." "Doctor," Putnam realized with growing horror, that everyone in the room was staring at him and his companions with barely controlled hunger, their eyes tracking every movement with the focused attention of predators evaluating potential prey. Whatever Hawthorne had been feeding these people, whatever psychological conditioning he had been implementing through his medicines and teachings, had transformed them at a fundamental level that went far beyond simple mental influence. "You've been drugging them," Putnam whispered, his voice barely audible in the candle-lit room. "Conditioning them chemically and psychologically to accept necessity," Hawthorne interrupted, his voice taking on the fervent tone of a preacher delivering a sermon to devoted followers. "To embrace the truth that your civilized society has spent centuries trying to deny. That survival requires the strong to consume the weak, that waste is the greatest sin, and that the human body provides the most perfect sustenance for human life." Hawthorne gestured toward the arranged body parts with obvious pride in his work. "In my homeland, which exists wherever winter is coldest and resources are scarcest, we learned that human fellowship requires sacrifice. The many sustain the few who are capable of leading them through the darkest times. These people have been transformed from weak, fearful creatures into something stronger, more unified, more capable of surviving whatever this harsh world can inflict upon them." Reverend Greenfield, who had remained silent until that moment, suddenly found his voice as the full horror of what he was witnessing penetrated his shock. "You're talking about cannibalism, about murder, about turning these people into monsters like yourself, abandoning every principle that separates human beings from wild beasts." Hawthorne's laugh was the most chilling sound any of them had ever heard. Not the laugh of a madman, but the genuinely amused response of someone who found their ignorance more pitiable than offensive. "Monsters, Reverend? Look around you carefully. These people are healthier than they've been all winter. Their children are growing strong and learning skills that will serve them for life. Their families are unified in purpose in ways that your empty promises of heavenly reward could never achieve. I've given them something infinitely more valuable than your abstract moral principles. I've given them the tools and the mindset to survive anything this world can inflict upon them." The confrontation that followed was swift, brutal, and unlike anything the men of Milbrook had ever experienced. Hawthorne's converts attacked the intruders with savage coordination, moving like a pack of predators who had hunted together many times before. Their movements were fluid and practiced, suggesting that this wasn't the first time they had been called upon to defend their transformed community against outside interference. Thomas Thornbury moved with inhuman speed, his farm-strengthened hands becoming claws that raked across Constable Hartwell's face before the man could draw his weapon. Grace Thornbury produced a butcher's knife from somewhere in her blood-stained dress and advanced on Reverend Greenfield with the focused determination of someone who had been trained for exactly this situation. Most horrifying of all were the children. Sarah, Mary, and William Thornbury attacked with coordination that spoke of extensive training, their small size allowing them to move underneath the men's defenses, while their complete lack of fear or hesitation made them far more dangerous than their age would suggest. They had been transformed into something that was no longer quite human, retaining their childish appearance while gaining the predatory instincts of natural killers. Dr. Putnam found himself fighting for his life against people he had known and treated for years, people whose children he had delivered and whose ailments he had cured. But the individuals attacking him bore only physical resemblance to the farmers and families he had called neighbors. Their personalities, their moral frameworks, their fundamental understanding of right and wrong had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt, according to Samuel Hawthorne's twisted philosophy. The battle was desperate and chaotic, fought with farm tools, kitchen knives, and bare hands in the confined space of the Thornbury house. The converts fought with the desperate ferocity of people defending not just their lives, but their entire world view, while the town leaders fought with the desperation of men who understood that failure meant not just death, but the complete corruption of everything they held sacred. Dr. Putnam barely escaped, carrying word of the horror to the rest of Milbrook while bleeding from multiple wounds and haunted by images that would never leave his memory. Joshua Fortesque managed to reach his horse and ride toward Bennington to bring help from outside authorities, though he would never make it to his destination. The others, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornbury, and Constable Hartwell, disappeared into the nightmare that the Thornbury house had become. By dawn, half the remaining population of Milbrook was mobilizing to end Samuel Hawthorne's reign of terror, but they were no longer fighting a single deranged individual. They were facing an organized community of converts who had been systematically prepared for exactly this confrontation and who regarded the approaching townspeople not as neighbors trying to save them, but as enemies threatening everything they had learned to value. The siege of the Thornbury house lasted 3 days and nights, becoming a nightmare of urban warfare fought between former neighbors who no longer recognized each other as human beings. The unconverted townspeople, led by Dr. Putnam and the few other community leaders who had escaped Hawthorne's initial trap, found themselves fighting not just for their lives, but for the soul of their community, against people they had known and trusted for years. Samuel Hawthorne had prepared for this eventuality with characteristic thoroughness. The house had been fortified with barricades and defensive positions that suggested months of planning. The converts had stockpiled weapons, food, and medical supplies that would allow them to withstand an extended siege. Most disturbing of all, they fought with coordination and tactical knowledge that indicated extensive training in organized violence. The unconverted townspeople quickly realized they were outmatched. Hawthorne's followers moved through the house and surrounding buildings with the fluid coordination of soldiers who had drilled together extensively. They used the terrain to their advantage, employing ambush tactics and psychological warfare that broke down the attackers' morale as much as their numbers. But perhaps the most effective weapon in Hawthorne's arsenal was the converts themselves. Seeing their former neighbors, friends, and family members transformed into predatory creatures willing to kill and cannibalize anyone who opposed them had a devastating psychological effect on the attacking townspeople. Many simply couldn't bring themselves to use lethal force against people they had known since childhood, even when those people were trying to kill them. Dr. Putnam documented the siege in journal entries that provide the most detailed account of what experts now consider one of the most successful examples of mass psychological conversion in American history. His writings describe the heartbreaking moments when fathers found themselves fighting their own children, when wives faced husbands across barricades, when the fundamental bonds of community and family were revealed to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. On the morning of the third day, the siege ended not with victory for either side, but with the complete disappearance of Samuel Hawthorne and his most devoted followers. When the exhausted townspeople finally broke through the house's defenses, they found it empty except for evidence of hasty preparation for departure. Hawthorne and his converts had vanished into the mountains, taking with them supplies, weapons, and preserved food that would allow them to survive indefinitely in the wilderness. The aftermath of Samuel Hawthorne's departure left Milbrook a broken community that would never recover from what it had experienced. Of the 43 people who had fallen under his influence to varying degrees, only 12 were ever seen again. They trickled back to town over the following weeks and months, hollow-eyed and refusing to speak about what they had experienced in the mountains with their former teacher. Most of these survivors left Milbrook within a year, unable to bear the memories or the suspicious looks of their former neighbors, who could never be entirely certain that the conversion process had been reversed. Some moved to distant cities, where they could start over with new identities. Others simply disappeared into the American frontier, perhaps seeking communities where their changed perspectives and unusual skills would be less conspicuous. Dr. Putnam spent the remaining years of his life documenting everything he could remember about Hawthorne's methods, teachings, and the systematic process by which an ordinary community had been transformed into a cannibalistic cult. His journals, preserved in the Vermont Historical Society's restricted archives, provide the most detailed account of what experts now believe was one of America's first recorded cases of mass psychological conditioning used to override fundamental moral taboos. The physical evidence was damning enough. When spring arrived and the snows melted, search parties found multiple cache sites throughout the mountains, containing preserved human remains and personal effects from dozens of missing persons spanning several years. The scale of Hawthorne's activities became clear. He had been operating throughout New England for at least a decade, preying on travelers and isolated families while perfecting his methods of psychological manipulation and human preservation. The cache sites revealed the sophisticated nature of Hawthorne's operation. He had established permanent supply depots throughout the mountain wilderness, each containing equipment for butchering, preserving, and storing human flesh, along with chemical supplies for producing the medicines he used to condition his victims. The organization and scale of these installations suggested that Hawthorne was not working alone, but was part of a larger network of individuals engaged in similar activities throughout the northeastern wilderness. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came in late April, when a hunter found what appeared to be a permanent settlement deep in the mountains, far from any established trails or settlements. The site included sophisticated food preservation equipment, medical instruments of unusual design, workshops for producing the strange tools and clothing that Hawthorne had carried, and detailed journals documenting his experiments in what he called survival psychology. These journals revealed that his activities in Milbrook weren't random predation or even simple cannibalism driven by hunger or madness. They were part of a carefully planned and methodically executed experiment in creating self-sustaining communities based on what Hawthorne described as post-civilizational survival protocols. His ultimate goal was apparently to develop techniques for maintaining human communities during extended periods of societal collapse, using methods that abandoned conventional moral constraints in favor of pure survival efficiency. The journals described similar experiments conducted in other isolated communities throughout New England over a period of nearly 15 years, each following the same basic pattern: infiltration during times of crisis, establishment of trust through genuine medical assistance, gradual introduction of unconventional survival practices, systematic psychological conditioning to overcome moral resistance, and finally either complete conversion of the community or elimination of witnesses, followed by relocation to a new testing ground. Most chilling of all were the detailed entries describing Hawthorne's long-term plans for expanding his operations. He had identified dozens of vulnerable communities throughout the northeastern mountains and had developed comprehensive strategies for infiltrating and converting each one. His ultimate vision appeared to be the creation of a network of cannibalistic communities that could support each other through the harshest winters and most severe societal disruptions, gradually spreading his philosophy throughout the isolated regions of New England and eventually beyond. The journals also revealed that Hawthorne was not the architect of this system, but rather a field operative, working for what appeared to be a larger organization dedicated to developing and testing survival strategies for anticipated societal collapse. References to the council and the directors suggested that his work was being monitored and guided by individuals with extensive resources and long-term planning capabilities. Samuel Hawthorne himself was never captured, despite extensive searches by local authorities, federal marshals, and military units deployed specifically to hunt down what officials privately referred to as the Milbrook incident. No trace of him was found after his departure from the town, leading to widespread speculation about his fate and whereabouts. Some investigators theorized that he had died in the wilderness, unable to survive without the support structure he had built in Milbrook. Others believed he had simply moved on to a new region, ready to begin his horrific work again in a place where no one would recognize his methods or connect him to previous incidents. The truth may be more disturbing than either theory suggests. In 1851, just 4 years after the Milbrook incident, reports began surfacing from isolated communities in northern Maine of a helpful stranger who appeared during harsh winters, offering medical assistance and survival advice to struggling families. In 1854, similar reports came from remote areas of New Hampshire, describing a man with pale eyes and medical knowledge who seemed to understand exactly what people needed to hear during their darkest moments. Each incident followed the same pattern that had devastated Milbrook. Arrival during a crisis, establishment of trust through effective medical treatment, gradual introduction of unconventional practices, and eventually either complete conversion of the target community or mysterious disappearances, followed by the stranger's departure. The last confirmed sighting of someone matching Hawthorne's description came in 1859, in a mining camp in northern Michigan, where desperate conditions during an unusually brutal winter had left the miners vulnerable to anyone offering hope and assistance. Witnesses described a man with pale eyes and prematurely white-streaked hair who claimed to come from distant lands beyond the great forests, where the old ways of survival are still honored. He stayed for 3 months, helping the miners survive conditions that had already killed several of their number. His medicines were remarkably effective. His advice about food preservation and rationing kept the camp supplied through the worst of the winter, and his leadership helped maintain morale during weeks when the temperature never rose above 0. When spring arrived and the mining company's supply wagons finally reached the camp, Hawthorne had vanished, taking with him 12 members of the mining community who were never seen again. The mining company's records, discovered decades later during research into industrial accidents of the 1850s, included disturbing details about the condition of the camp when the supply wagons arrived. The remaining miners displayed behavioral changes consistent with those observed in Milbrook survivors: obsessive hoarding of food, unusual dietary preferences involving raw meat, and social dynamics that suggested the community had developed hierarchical structures based on principles very different from conventional mining camp organization. Dr. Putnam's final journal entry, written shortly before his death from pneumonia in 1863, contained a warning that has haunted researchers and law enforcement officials for over a century. The man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something about human nature that civilized people prefer to ignore. That under the right conditions, with the proper techniques and sufficient patience, anyone can be convinced that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. He didn't create monsters from ordinary people. He revealed the monsters that already existed within them, waiting for permission to emerge. Putnam's warning proved prophetic in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The American Civil War, which began just 14 years after the Milbrook incident, provided numerous examples of ordinary citizens committing atrocities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The industrial disasters and social upheavals of the late 19th century repeatedly demonstrated how quickly civilized communities could descend into savage competition for resources when survival became the primary concern. Modern psychological research has confirmed many of Dr. Putnam's observations about the techniques Samuel Hawthorne used to convert an entire community to his twisted worldview. Studies of cult indoctrination, military conditioning, and survival psychology have identified the same basic principles that Hawthorne applied with such devastating effectiveness. Gradual introduction of extreme concepts, creation of dependency relationships, isolation from alternative viewpoints, and systematic breaking down of moral boundaries through incremental steps that each seem reasonable in context. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often come not from supernatural forces or random violence, but from the systematic exploitation of human psychology by individuals who understand how to manipulate our deepest instincts and most fundamental needs. The story of Samuel Hawthorne reminds us that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, and that the line between healer and destroyer, between teacher and corrupter, can disappear entirely when survival becomes the only virtue that matters. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or could there be more to Samuel Hawthorne's true identity and the organization he apparently served? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really drove this man to such extremes, and whether his network of survival communities might still exist in remote areas of our country. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that make you question how much we really know about the people around us. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter from the shadows of American history that authorities tried to bury forever.